Here we see a human athlete on a variable weight resistance machine, such as you would typically see at the gym. We're rather more limited for horses, but I want you to be clear about load, repetitions, sets, tempo, recovery, percentage of maximal load, intensity of effort, utilising gravity by changing position, and open and closed kinetic chain exercise. For this, you need to be thinking about what you are aiming for the exercise that you have prescribed to ultimately achieve. Is it strength? Is it stamina? Is it possibly elements of proprioception and sport-specific skills? For skill, we want more sport-specific exercises, but bear with me for the fundamentals of exercise programming for now. So we can see from this image that the athlete has isolated the quadriceps and hamstrings with some mild gastrocnemius and soleus, transverse and rectus abdominis muscle activity, so some core muscle activation there. But this is not what I would call sports specific for horse riders, because the upper body is static, although it could give them greater awareness of their anterior core muscle engagement. And gravity is being used to target flexion and extension of the hip and knee joints, and some ankle joint activation there. So the gravity is because the load is bearing towards the athlete and the athlete has to control it. And for this, she is receiving maximal support for the spine while she is strengthening these muscles. So although this isn't sport specific for the rider, we do not want them to injure their spine at the expense of strengthening their limbs. So in the early stages, we could recommend this exercises, but later on we would want to be more sport specific in exercising the rider seated vertically. So we can vary the number of times the athlete flexes and extends her lower limbs to represent the number of repetitions performed. I just want to put in there though that the flexion in this exercise would be passive. So the machine, as it's set up, the weights would be themselves moving towards the athlete. So the athlete is working on the eccentric or extending the limb. That's where the muscle power is, where she's getting that from, or having to utilize the power of her muscles. Let's say that's 10 repetitions. Then she rests and then she performs 10 more. The multiple of the repetitions between resting is called the set. Let's say she performs 3 sets of 10 repetitions of this single exercise. We can vary the recovery time between sets, which will help stimulate the strengthening or stamina or endurance building mechanisms. We can vary how fast or how slow the repetitions are performed. Which will impact on recovery periods. We can determine the load of what 1 repetition maximum would be for that athlete. So how much can she push once without failure at that time? So that's 1 complete push. How much weight does it take so that she can perform only one repetition of it? This is not an entirely accurate or reliable measure of strength, since with practice her neurological system will soon figure out how she can strategize that so that it would not require a net gain in strength to do so. But let's use this result so that we can now calculate how many repetitions and sets she can achieve towards the desired goal of increased strength and or stamina or duration. This is not going to be possible for the horse without increasing injury risk, and it may also expose the human athlete to injury risk. Therefore, it may not even be possible to establish the repetition maximum if the athlete is carrying an injury. We could, however, use this calculation if we were targeting abdominal core strength in the rider and perhaps gastrocnemius for the show jumping rider, as we would have isolated those muscles for targeting. It may not be useful to use unilateral limb action, so just one limb at a time, on this machine for this exercise or repetition, as this may produce asymmetry in the pelvis. But it may be more sport specific if we were able to mimic more of an astride limb position. So if this plate was wider, for example, we may then be able to activate the abductors and adductors, and this would have more of a sport specific element to it. So you need to take care that the body part or parts you are exercising is going to produce the desired result. This may be great for rather narrow horses, but this rider may struggle on wide horses if she is going to create full engagement of the quadriceps and hamstrings. As I said earlier, she would need to have addressed the adductors and abductors to be able to reproduce this strength on a wider horse. A rider may be more suited to standing wide leg squats, perhaps with weights resting on the thighs for sport specific impact. So for that, we would take her off this machine, we would have her standing more wide, and we would ask her to perform leg squats, so flexing the hip and knee joints, but we could put a weight in each of her hands and she could hold them against the thighs to add more resistance. So always take time to have a good look. Analyze the type of exercise you are prescribing or providing or suggesting. Analyze the type of exercise you are suggesting or recommending, because there may be a better sport-specific way to do that. But of course, if this is for rehabilitative exercise programming, then she may well be doing this in the early stage, whereas standing astride may be for the late and return to sport stage. When considering intensity of effort, we can use the concept of repetitions in reserve, or RIR, so that if we have determined that this athlete can push, say, 30 kilos as one repetition maximum, we can reduce this to, say, 15 kilos so that she could perform more repetitions and sets to work on developing strength and stamina or endurance. So that's the explanation for repetitions in reserve. And strictly speaking, athletes wouldn't normally always be working in maximal effort. So it's important to know how much, or to establish how much effort or intensity the athlete is working at during your exercise. How can we apply this to the horse? Well, we could revisit the bounce fence exercise for our repetitions and sets, and consider that each element of that fence is a repetition and each completion of the grid is one set. That does not necessarily mean that adding a line of bounce fences or poles is indicated. 6 bounce fences is a huge amount of effort, and so is a line of 10 ground poles. Again, think about what your exercises are aiming to achieve and whether or not you can reduce injury risk by using another exercise. 6 bounce fences may strain the sacroiliac joint, whereas trotting slowly as a repetition in sets may not, but you would still get, for example, a strength gain.